Gabriel Swagard had, for weeks, maintained his silence. He remained steadfast in his ministry responsibilities and refused to address the mounting accusations that were circulating about his family. As he went about his Sunday sermons, smiling and mingling with the crowd, he gave the impression that he was completely at ease. Job duties as if nothing had transpired. However, individuals who were familiar with him well could discern that he was burdened by something. His grin was beginning to wane. He seemed exhausted, and he had grown distant at family reunions. Gabriel would discreetly exit the room or shift the conversation whenever his father, Donnie Swaggart, or grandmother, Frances, were brought up in a negative context by the media. At the church, people started to take note. Some people assumed Gabriel was merely attempting to stay out of trouble. Some thought he was trying to conceal something. Contrary to popular belief, Gabriel always gave his words plenty of consideration. From a young age, he witnessed firsthand how others could twist and alter even the simplest of statements. As a result, he decided to rationalize his emotional response by, "Be patient. I will pray," he said. To himself he turned, not to mention his secret wish for the problem to resolve itself before word got out. Regrettably, the situation deteriorated worse. Like a hurricane you can see coming but couldn't do anything to stop, the pressure steadily increased. Because remaining silent was no longer an option, Gabriel knew he would eventually have to speak. The tranquility was brief. A little murmur started it all. During a quiet church lunch, someone made a remark that quickly became the topic of conversation across the ministry. The formidable family matriarch, Frances Swaggart, supposedly leveled a grave charge, the likes of which nobody dared to hope for. In a private situation, Frances confronted Donnie Swaggart and accused him of betrayal, not only as a son, but also as a spiritual leader, according to close family friends. Information about there was still no concrete accusation. One thing, nevertheless, was assured. Donnie had crossed an insurmountable line, in Frances's opinion. This wasn't your average family quarrel. Something profound, sentimental, and individual was at work here. Frances, according to those close to the family, appeared distraught rather than furious. During her chats, her voice, which had once been strong and assured, had begun to waver. In the past, she had never backed down from standing up for her son. Yet this occasion was different. She meant no harm by what she said. Because she was so hurt, she spoke up. The decision Donnie had made within the ministry was supposedly at the center of it. For some, it was a matter of betrayed familial devotion. But the complete truth was never officially disclosed by Frances. Worst part was her straightforward statement. "This isn't what our family stands for." The congregation was in utter uncertainty. The truth was a mystery to everyone. Speculation intensified with each passing day. Although this was going on, Gabriel was caught in the crossfire. He was split between the two people he cared about most in the world. It was important to him not to take a side. All he wanted to know was why his grandpa and dad had become so estranged. However, things got worse because neither side said a word. Regardless of his level of preparedness, Gabriel would soon have no choice but to confront the truth. The mood within the swaggering home became heavier as the days passed. For what? From low, hushed murmurs, tension quickly built, leading to abrupt outbursts of anger and finally, the abrupt closing of once hushed doors. Even though Gabriel had always imagined his family as one, he now felt as though he was residing in a split house. Donnie, who was notorious for his fervent preaching, began to shun Frances, who was normally the serene and collected matriarch. Any communication with his mom at all. The lack of conversation at dinner time made the meal taste cold. There was no longer the sound of laughing that permeated family meals. There was a clamoring behind closed doors. Anger like no one had ever seen before broke out within the family, according to those close to them. Misunderstood and betrayed, Donnie felt. Francis perceived his decisions as harmful and self-centered, even though he thought he had made tough choices for the ministry. Dear Gabriel. He frequently found himself in the center, attempting to appease all parties involved. However, his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He could no longer bear the emotional burden. While his father was his first love, he held his grandmother in the highest regard. He felt something inside his chest tighten as he watched them fight. I didn't. It's no longer a private issue. It has begun to have an impact on the church. Everyone on staff could feel the stress. According to some, Donnie had grown cold and protective. Francis had stopped showing up to some of the meetings that others had noted. Even many who had been with the ministry for a while began to have questions. This kind of discord was difficult to conceal in a household that advocated for harmony and pardon. What a devastating experience for Gabriel. His faith in his family's ability to triumph despite adversity had never wavered. At this point, though, it seemed as though the very groundwork they laid was beginning to break. Gabriel had always been consistent, so he knew something would happen shortly. His consistent presence brought solace to many in the church, whether it was for Sunday morning services, midweek prayer sessions, or ministry events. His soothing voice and his courteous manner, and the gracefulness with which he continued his family's history. However, all of a sudden, he vanished. After then, another Sunday went by. There was a lack of clarification. On stage, his chair was vacant. The whispers started almost immediately after his name was omitted. Many in the congregation were perplexed. Was he unwell? Was he on a journey? Alternatively, did something go wrong in the background? Where honesty is valued was delivered from the platform, those there were alarmed by Gabriel's lack of response. The chronology was beginning to be pieced together. Rumors about Francis and Donnie's disagreement began to circulate shortly after he vanished. Gabriel was allegedly trying to distance himself from the matter, according to some. Some thought he had finally snapped emotionally. It might have been too much for someone who has always strived to maintain tranquility. Members of Gabriel's inner circle, meanwhile, painted a picture of a man struggling to maintain composure despite obvious pain. He devoted less time with the spotlight on them. Even his closest friends and members of the media were unable to reach him. He had no remorse about concealing. Due of discomfort, he was withdrawing, being torn apart from his loved ones. It broke his heart to see them quarrel, and know he couldn't do anything to help. Gabriel had not had such uncertainty about his role in the family or the ministry for a long time. Something, though, was growing inside of him. He gained insight throughout his time away. In an effort to find the correct words, he started writing, praying, and looking within. It seemed inevitable that he would speak up at some point. People were eager to learn the truth, but they wanted to know it from someone they could trust. Instead of preparing to defend or strike, Gabriel was getting ready to express his mind. Now it was only a matter of when he would speak. That was the time. It transpired on a tranquil Thursday night. It was a well-kept secret among those not directly involved. Beyond Gabriel, Donnie, and Francis, and two of the ministries, there were no friends, no church personnel, and no outside voices. Longest-serving, most revered counselor. No longer could the family afford to remain silent. There was a buildup of too much anguish. Far too much had been left unsaid. The meeting had been requested by Gabriel. Above all else, he yearned for healing, and he needed answers. If they could just sit down together, free from judgment, preaching, and microphones, he thought they would be able to figure out how to move ahead. From the very beginning, the room was charged with intense emotion. Her eyes were weary, but resolute as Francis sat with a subtle power. Donnie was the last to arrive, and he did so with a stiff face, not from arrogance but from the knowledge that something monumental was about to happen. Standing in the center, Gabriel held the past and the future close to his heart. It wasn't furious when they started talking. That was uncooked. Frances took the lead. Though gentle, her words conveyed a lifetime of letdown. She expressed her frustration with feeling neglected and the decision-making process. She felt that Donnie had strayed from the principles she had instilled in him, and she had no voice to express this. While remaining silent, Donnie's expression betrayed his anguish. His voice quivered as he finally spoke. Rather of acting in defiance, he confessed that he had acted. Strains on the ministry, as it strives to preserve its relevance in an evolving environment. On numerous occasions, he felt utterly alone, isolated, and misunderstood. Frances now saw a man bearing the burden of expectation, rather than a defiant son. After then, Gabriel spoke. He spoke softly, but with great feeling. He spoke to them about the ways in which their disagreement had impacted him as a believer, pastor, and son or grandchild. Preaching, he added, was foundational, but the example they set as a family was even more so. And that example was shattered at this very moment. Weepies were cried. At the end of the day, nobody settled anything. Then, though, things changed. Over the course of months, if not years, the walls that had been constructed started to crumble. There was no climax, no resolution. But for the very first time, rather than viewing one another as adversaries, everyone there viewed one another as relatives. For Gabriel, it was the initial concrete stride toward recovery. People flocked to the sanctuary the following Sunday. Lurking rumors circulated that Gabriel Swagard would be making a triumphant return to the pulpit, and not merely for the purpose of preaching. Instinctively, everyone knew that a significant statement was about to be made. There was a distinct, weighty, anticipatory vibe in the room that morning, and the choir's voices were low. Upon Gabriel's arrival on stage, nothing grandiose or theatrical was done to introduce it. He remained motionless and silent as he held a Bible and a folded piece of paper. He began without a verse. Greetings were non-existent on his face. Commented, "Bears." The crowd went silent as Gabriel talked from the heart, unfiltered and honest, not in his role as pastor but as a son, grandson, and man. His voice quivered slightly at the beginning, but he didn't hold back. Raw. He refrained from blaming or identifying anyone. Instead, he shared the anguish he and his family had been through, the bewilderment, the broken trust, and the emotional burden he had been stifling for weeks. Gabriel paused, wiped his eyes, and continued. He said there were things said in anger, moments of hurt, and misunderstandings that nearly tore them apart. But he also spoke of love, how deeply he loved both his father and his grandmother, and how torn he felt watching them drift apart. Said, "I understand that some of you were hoping that I would choose a side, but the reality is that throughout my life, I have always stood by the side of healing, grace, and truth. My family is important to me. In spite of our frailties, I have faith that God can mend us." I wasn't, he confessed. His absence had been a time of soul-searching, that he had wrestled with doubt, and he apologized to the church and the congregation for his delayed response, explaining that he needed time, not to prepare a response, but to find peace within himself first. By the time he finished, many in the audience were moved to tears. Gabriel did not offer an argument or explanation. Rather, he presented a confession of love, anguish, and hope. There was silence, no clapping, just a peaceful, moving moment when hearts were moved by something genuine. The following morning, after Gabriel's moving statement, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere surrounding the ministry. People were still trying to make sense of what they had heard the night before, and his action served as a reminder of why they had trusted him for so long, not only because of his words, but also because of his heart. Many were moved, some were astonished, and some were quietly introspective after hearing Gabriel's speech. However, everyone was curious about what Donnie Swaggart would have said, since he hadn't been in the room during it, and had avoided the limelight for days. Donnie stood behind his normal pulpit at a midweek service the following Wednesday. The crowd was slightly smaller, but his quiet screamed volumes about his thoughts and feelings. However, the congregation was filled with expectation as he began with a prayer and proceeded to deliver a well-known sermon about spiritual perseverance. However, just when they believed he would conclude without mentioning the problem, Donnie paused, slowly looked up, closed his Bible, and then glanced across the room. "Sometimes the people we love the most are also the ones who show us the truth," he said in a measured, concise, and emotionally charged manner. He avoided naming Gabriel or explicitly addressing the accusation or the family gathering, but his comment captured everyone's attention. Profound realities. And at times, that reality is difficult to stomach, but essential. His speech was deliberate, as if he were picking his words carefully. "I've tried to live my life according to my beliefs, even though not everyone gets them. For the sake of the legacy we hold and the purpose we fulfill, rather than for my own sake." Donnie did not weep nor display rage, but there was a subtle sadness in his voice that revealed how much the events unfolding behind the scenes had touched him. Sceneries. He glanced around the audience and chimed in. "Family can be complicated, but I believe in redemption. I have faith that God is working, even when we don't see it." He then proceeded to say nothing further regarding the matter, ended the service with a prayer, expressed gratitude to the congregation, and then stepped down. Many were confused. Some took his remarks as an indication of humility, while others believed he was trying to sidestep the real problem. However, one thing was clear: Donnie had heard Gabriel's message, and this was his method of replying. Not with reasons or defenses, but with a gentle recognition that things had changed and that perhaps, he was also prepared to move forward with his own healing. With the family drama quietly surfacing throughout the ministry, it was soon enough for the. As rumors of discord began to go beyond the Swagard home, they began to seep into the church, a once united and faith-filled community. Gone are the days of open discussion of scripture and fellowship. Instead, rumors revolve around Francis's comments, Donnie's reaction, and what? Even though everyone had an opinion, not everyone agreed with Gabriel's emotional message. Some church members, who have followed Francis Swaggart for decades and revered her knowledge, elegance, and unfaltering strength, remained firmly behind her. To them, she was the rock upon which the ministry rested, they said, someone who had always stood for truth, even when it hurt. They assumed that since Francis had spoken out, something major must have happened. They lauded Gabriel's bravery in speaking out and his decision to choose transparency over silence. However, there were those who had a different perspective. They rallied behind Donnie not merely because of his preaching career, but also because they believed in his journey. They perceived him as a guy who had, for many years, frequently under tremendous duress, borne the burden of a rapidly expanding ministry. They believed that too many presumptions had been made about him, and that the whole story hadn't been told. They thought Donnie was being misinterpreted because of his measured response during his sermon. Then there were the ones caught in the middle. People who loved the Swaggart family as a whole and were saddened to see them go through this difficult period were longtime members of the church, who had seen the ministry's ups and downs, and wanted nothing more than to see the family healed and find peace. Making amends. The rift was more than just emotional behind the scenes. As church employees subtly requested time off, volunteers started requesting reassignment, and some ministry partners even cut off financial assistance. The church leadership attempted to maintain stability, But the tension had clearly permeated the pews as members waited to see what would happen. Despite the split, one thing was evident: people still loved profoundly. They weren't merely speculating. They were mourning the loss of the spiritual home they had formed around this family, which they were now seeing crumble under the strain of internal strife. The world lauded Gabriel Swagard for his candor and poise, but few understood the profound impact that the events of the previous few weeks had on the grandson of a great ministry and the son of a notable figure, a man whose battle was hidden behind his composed demeanor and steady voice. Preacher, and now the unanticipated link between two generations trapped in an agonizing stillness. Outwardly, he exuded strength, but behind closed doors, he was weary, exhausted, and perpetually seeking answers. Those closest to Gabriel said that he had difficulty sleeping, and his appetite waned. The weight of protecting the people he loved from disintegration was too great, and he often sat alone in the sanctuary after everyone had left, murmuring prayers under his breath. Betray his father. He drew a line not to leave his grandmother, but he came to terms with the fact that he was gradually disintegrating while he tried to keep everyone else together. Faith had always been Gabriel's rock, but even that had been shaken. For a while, he doubted his calling and wondered if he was up to the task he had taken on. He thought of running away, not from God but from the limelight, to regroup, to be himself again, but a still, small voice within him kept him going. Was a reminder to him that leadership isn't always about being strong. Sometimes it's about bending down, crying, and allowing God to fill the gaps when strength fails. The people only witnessed snippets of his moving lecture, his carefully selected words, but the true fight was things that were going on in his heart. He kept quiet about the burden he carried when his church family relied on him for reconciliation. He kept quiet about the anguish he felt when people chose sides within his family. All he wanted was to be whole again. Faith was his rock through it all. Even in the quiet, dark hours when no one else was there, he held on to the hope that healing could come. Grace could reach even the deepest wounds. And he knew that faith couldn't erase the agony. Occasionally, even if the storm hadn't subsided, something had changed. People had spoken out, and quiet had been broken. The Swaggart family found themselves at a crossroads. Not just as people, but as ministry leaders observed by millions. The anguish was ongoing. The wounds were still raw. However, for the first time in a considerable period, there was additionally something else in the mistake. The possibility. The hope that healing could start. The realization that forgiveness, difficult though it may be, was not impossible. Gabriel Swagard maintained his leadership style of quiet power. He refrained from making grand claims or theatrical proclamations. Instead, he concentrated on. He met with church members behind the scenes, listened to their concerns, and asked for their continued prayers. He knew trust would take time to rebuild, but he believed it could be based on honesty, not performance. Frances Swaggart remained graceful. He rebuilt slowly through prayer, presence, and humility. She remained steadfast in her beliefs and continued to attend services, sitting near the front row, listening carefully, and taking part in quiet prayer circles. Although she refrained from publicly speaking again, her presence spoke volumes.